Welcome to everyone joining us today online for the Animals and Society Research Initiative Distinguished Lecture Series. We'd like to start off with a territorial acknowledgement. We acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Vasanish peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. My name is Manisha Deka, and I'm Professor and Lansdowne Chair at the University of Victoria. I also direct the Animals and Society Research Initiative, which, for those of you who may not know, is a research forum and working group at the University of Victoria for those interested in the critical examination of normalized practices and conceptualizations of human, animal, and interspecies relations. We'd like to acknowledge the generous funding by the Brooks Institute for Animal Rights, Law and Policy for this lecture series. Thanks also to our co-presenters at the University of Victoria for this lecture, the Center for Indigenous Research and Community-Led Engagement, or CIRCLE, the Indigenous Law Research Unit, or ILRU, the Center for Global Studies, the Department of Gender Studies, and the Center for Studies in Religion and Society. We are so thrilled to be welcoming a wide range of participants to today's lecture from 13 different countries. Thank you all for joining us from your time zones. Today, we welcome Dr. Margaret Robinson, presenting under the title Animal-Centric Storytelling in Migma Social Research. Dr. Robinson is Associate Professor in the Departments of English, Sociology, and Social Anthropology at Dalhousie University in what is known as Halifax, Nova Scotia. Her research is supported by the Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Reconciliation, Gender, and Identity. Dr. Robinson is a Two-Spirit scholar and a member of Lennox Island First Nation who grew up in the Eskikewa'kik district of Mi'kmaq in what is currently Nova Scotia. Author of multiple research papers and book chapters, her research interests include food sovereignty and how cultural identity, language, and the arts can promote well-being for oppressed people. We'll have time following her presentation for a Q&A period, so please post your questions in the chat, and I'll order those and read them out. So with our warm welcome to you, I'll now turn the floor over to you, Dr. Robinson.
Thank you, Manisha. So, hello, my name is Margaret Robinson. I'm a Two-Spirit Mi'kmaq scholar and a member of Lennox Island First Nation. I work as an associate professor at Dalhousie University. And there I'm in the departments of English and Sociology and Social Anthropology, both of which come together in this kind of work that I do. So I have training in textual hermeneutics and did a degree in English. And I've also been doing a lot of social science research under the general heading we sometimes call cultural determinants of health. So most of my health work, most of my social science work, that research looks at the relationship between culture and well-being. Particularly when I engage Migma stories in my work, I'm looking to describe stories and animal-related themes in those stories, and then offer points to ponder in terms of how does the story relate to culture and well-being. So I'm going to do some of that today. I'm going to talk about how I've engaged particular stories. I'm going to describe some of those stories and the themes I see going on, and then I'll offer some caveats and warnings for folks looking to do similar research of their own. So I'll start with a bit of background. The Mi'kmaq call themselves the Olnu, and we're an indigenous nation whose unceded territory of Mi'kmaq lies on the northeastern coast of North America. And the Mi'kmaq have lived in this territory for certainly 13,000 years. There's evidence in the archaeology work that's been done that puts human occupation there in that territory that long ago. So we're looking at the time of the last glacial retreat, and around the time of the distinction and decline of the megafauna, including things like the giant beaver. This painting here on the left shows the relative size of the giant beaver to the contemporary beaver. There's some interesting sculpture you can find out there that portrays the size of the giant beaver as well. And you can see some of the fossilized bone, including skull fragments, skull pieces that show how incredibly large this megafauna is. And so why do I mention this? Well, the giant beaver shows up in our stories sometimes. And so there are tales of these giant beavers. And back before we had the evidence to show that there had been beavers this size in the territory, people would sometimes discuss about what did the size of the beaver mean? Was it symbolic? But in fact, there had just been giant beavers. And this information about the existence of these creatures continued in our oral traditions, perhaps as long as 13,000 years. And so this information is encoded into stories. The stories aren't just interesting tales to keep people occupied before the invention of television. They're important. They're culturally important. And so what I look to the stories for might be a little different than what we would generally look for in like an English literature examination. So Clifford Paul, who's the coordinator of the Moose Management Initiative with Unama'ki Institute of Natural Resources, has done some work that involves Migma stories. And one of the stories he works with describes the shift from the megafauna of that period, 13,000 plus years ago, to the animals that we know today. The story features Glooskap, who's a Mi'kmaq cultural hero. And the story starts off when humans were afraid of other animals due to their enormous size. As Paul relates, the bear was too big, gigantic in fact, as was the wolf, the beaver, the wildcat. Even the squirrel was too big. The people were in fear of doing what they had to do in the forest, the necessary activities to take care of themselves and their families. Glooskap recognized the problem, and since he loved the people, he endeavored to find a solution. The answer came quick. He told the people he would stroke the animals, lovingly pet them until they got to the size his people were comfortable and safe with. So he held the bear, and he petted it until it reached its present size. He did the same with the wildcat, the wolf, the beaver, and yes, even the squirrel, until all the animals were brought to their present size. You can see this very scientific image here on the left is from Joanne Hammond of Kamloops Archaeology. Clifford Paul's tale about Glooskap petting the giant animals and helping them shrink is very interesting to me. Paul speculates that this story communicates a metaphorical truth about evolution. I find it intriguing that the solution to human fear is not violence toward animals in this story, but is loving care. Glooskap's gentle petting nurtures animals into a smaller form that enables humans to live in safety. And so when I look to our traditional stories, I'm primarily looking for values. What are some of the values that are embedded in the things the characters do, the things that the characters say? What are the lessons, the cultural reasons why this story might have been shared many, many times? One of the issues I'm interested in is story transmission. So although the Mi'kmaq have a written language, we didn't use it to tell stories. Stories were traditionally told verbally. And so stories then encapsulate our cultural worldviews and our practices. They're how we pass on those things to other people. Within a story, you might learn all of the things that you need to do a particular task. And families use stories as part of their daily life. So some stories will accompany particular activities. And so you might hear the same story over 5 or 10 years told many times in many different ways. Oral cultures use memory a lot. And so memory plays a central role in storytelling because you don't have a text to which you can refer. You're recalling the concepts and the ideas and the pieces of the story each time you want to tell the story. And each telling further re-ingrains that memory of the story in your own mind. Psychologist Marcy Driscoll talks about the process of memory formation. In that senses introduce new information. Our sense memory stores that information briefly. And then as our working memory determines what about that information is significant, we then finally integrate the significant information into our long-term memory. How do we remember enough to be able to tell a story? Part of it is gesture. So the image above is Shaun Jodrey. She's a Mi'kmaq playwright. And she delivered an entire play in which she's the only character, memorizing all the lines, all the dialogue, all the pieces of the play. And to do that, including language that is not her first language, she's reclaiming Mi'kmaq. She incorporated physical gestures to help her remember what was the line. So when she refers to the tree, Kokwam, that's the character in the play, this large tree around which a number of people have various scenes. She'll touch particular parts of the tree, and that helps her embody that memory of, what do I say? What is the line? And so the way that stories get told, the gestures that accompany them, the smells, the locations, all of these help in securing the story itself in the memory. Science teacher Tim Roos connects this style of passing on knowledge with contemporary active learning principles. And so I can definitely see some layovers, some overlaps with kinesthetic learning that I've used in my own classrooms. Roos emphasizes that the aim in traditional storytelling is not to memorize the words of the story, but to be able to recall the ideas. So these ideas can be accessed in multiple contexts and integrated with our other learning. And this is one of the reasons that stories vary from one telling to the next, as narratives are adjusted to suit the audience and their stage of life and their needs in that particular moment. So we often encounter this when we would ask elders in our family to tell a particular story of which we were fond. And each time the story was slightly different than we might have remembered it, and slightly different, I'm sure, than they told it last time. Because last time they told the story, maybe I was too young for some elements of the story that they didn't want to quite share with someone who was a precocious 7-year-old, but might be more comfortable sharing with a precocious 12-year-old. And so elements of the storyteller relationship to the person listening to the story come into how the story gets told. Stories transmit our culture and our identity. Dr. Marie Baptiste talks about stories and the languages in which we share them, and says that they tell all that is meaningful for understanding ourselves individually and collectively as human beings. And it's certainly true, I think, for the Mi'kmaq. Stories transmit Mi'kmaq perspectives, what it means to be a Mi'kmaq person, and how we should relate to other beings in our lives. Our stories tell us our relationships with other animals and the values by which those relationships should be governed. So I'll give you an example of the story I'm quite fond of, called Wolverine and His Brother. Some versions call it Badger and His Brother, because whoever was translating the Mi'kmaq apparently didn't know the difference between a badger and a wolverine. So the story goes, two hungry brothers come upon a lake, and there are a number of species of birds resting on the lake. And seeing the birds, Wolverine hatches a plan. So he and his brother construct a wigwam, a traditional Mi'kmaq house, and they put a heavy door on the wigwam. And then they invite all the birds inside for a feast. Wolverine asks the birds to close their eyes, and then he begins to kill them silently, one after another. His younger brother becomes distraught because Wolverine has killed more birds than they can eat. And so he whispers to the smallest bird to open his eyes, and the little bird does. And seeing the carnage inside the wigwam, the young bird cries in alarm, wakes the whole group, and working together, the birds knock down the heavy door and escape. So the ideas that I was examining in that story when I was analyzing it were looking for things that it tells us about birds, hunting, and responsibility, because those were the things that seemed most clearly relevant. I thought, this is a story that you tell boys who might go out hunting to explain to them why they mustn't kill more than they can eat. That's why it's Wolverine and his brother out together hunting. But then I also thought, well, the birds working together to escape the wigwam could be a message too. That could be about teamwork being essential for survival. And the more I sat with the story and thought about it, the more I began to see the sense of communal responsibility that was embedded in the tale. Even if the destruction is done by a brother, our obligation is to intervene to protect the most vulnerable. And so the more I sat with some of the stories, the more obvious messages they seemed to have. And the more I got to know my own community and the values that people held, the more I could see overlaps. One of these values is called Nadukalimp, which is usually used to describe subsistence hunting, cultivating, generally hunting and fishing. The Native Council of Nova Scotia describes it as a spiritual practice that uses the bounty of nature for the self-support and well-being of the individual and the nation. But an examination of the word's origin suggests that it can be translated as avoiding not having enough rather than accumulating abundance. So if Nagumi is about avoiding not having enough, it distinguishes that concept from subsistence practices that are related to hunting and fishing to accumulate profit. It distinguishes from subsistence practices from hunting or fishing for sport, which many of the Mi'kmaq view as immoral. And it suggests that Nagumi entails a duty to protect the animals on which the Mi'kmaq rely for food. And so this need that shows up recurringly in the stories to protect particular animals and to particularly animals that have a food significance among the Mi'kmaq. I find this really interesting for me because a lot of my work is in food sovereignty. And so anything that has to do with how people distinguish one animal from another in terms of some are for food and some are not, but also what are our obligations to the animals that serve as food? And how are those relationships determined? That's the part I find intriguing to tease out from the stories. I started analyzing Migma Stories in 2012. I was living in downtown Toronto and I was looking to stay engaged with my Mi'kmaq culture while being in someone else's territory. So Toronto's the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat. And so I was an uninvited visitor in their territory. And so looking to how do I stay and become more Mi'kmaq while living in this very, very urban space. And so traditional stories were a way I started to do that. Some of my early work that examined Mi'kmaq stories was published in Societies and Canadian Journal of Native Studies. And I was really looking at how stories presented animals. In 2012, I had been vegan for a while, a couple of years at that point, and I was trying to figure out what do I do with this when a lot of our cultural traditions around a lot of our social traditions in Indigenous communities are about food, particularly about meat. And so I worried, I've got this new thing that I'm doing. It feels really good, but is it going to separate me more from my Indigenous culture? And what can we do about that? And so much of my story analysis work was related to these issues about food and cultural connection. And what I noticed is that the Mi'kmaq stories I was reading presented beings, really all beings, as made by a creator spirit. So there's a theological claim in these stories. And each being is presented as having its own spirit. And as one member of Eskikewa'kik First Nation described the view of animals as resulting from close observation of them over time. So this participant in one study said, you learn so much about the animal. You learn about their habits, you learn about where they sleep, when they rest, you'll learn about their relationship with their family, you'll learn about their spirituality. Not much different than yours and mine, they said, in this study by Kinnear in 2007. So this study describes the views of participants as almost similar to that found in deep ecology or ecofeminism or social ecology, but with different origins in those viewpoints and different legal standing within Canada. The Mi'kmaq recognize animals as having a spirit and also see spirit in things that other people might view as inanimate. So rocks, water, weather, fire. And so animals, including humans, are generally framed as part of a big, interconnected and interreliant web of created life. Patricia Doyle-Bedwell, a Mi'kmaq scholar, and Faye Cohen note that there are similarities between humans and other spirited beings, and that this means that all creation is sacred and all creation is equal. So what I was seeing in the stories was a very egalitarian approach to being. And within that, there was still meat eating. And so I was curious as to how does this differ from some of the models that I had seen coming from other traditions. And so what I was particularly interested in was how it differs from the Christian model of domination over the animal world. Members of Eskikewa'kik also considered animals as equally important, and some animals held special meaning because particular families or individuals had been involved in relating to that animal for a long period of time. So people had special relationships with special types of animals, and we see this come through in the stories as well. So one telling of the story called Mooin the Bear's Child is about a boy who's raised by bears. And this one record of the story identifies the boy as an ancestor of the Syllaboy family, and noting that his relatives belong to the bear. And so this is available in a collection called Migma Anthology. And I found this intriguing because when you read the story, it's very similar to other child raised by animal stories. Child wanders off from the village, found, or in some versions of the story is attempted to be done away with by an evil stepfather. But the bear comes and rescues him and raises him as her own. And so they develop this emotional relationship. And bears in many indigenous communities, particularly among the Mi'kmaq, is often seen as a symbol of motherhood. And so this idea that the female bear is particularly caring about young comes through very much in the story. And the relationship is two ways. So when human hunters attack and kill Muin's mother, he steps forward to defend his bear siblings. And so the connection of the story to a particular specific family whose members I know, I found intriguing because it blurs that distinction between here is a story that we all accept as metaphorical, and here is a story that says something real about people we actually know in a daily way. Traditional stories also feature spiritual and supernatural relations with animals. So one of these is the invisible boy. The invisible boy is a really long story. It's got all kinds of separate involved parts. But one of the parts, particularly, I'll focus in on. So the invisible boy was a story told to Silas Rand, who was a Baptist minister, by Susan Barse of Charlottetown, PEI, in the winter of 1848. And the part I was interested in features a hunter who's able to transform into a moose. And this connection makes him a formidable hunter. He's lived as a moose, he's walked as a moose, so he knows what it is to be a moose, and it helps him catch moose. But it also leaves him vulnerable to injury. So when a moose femur that is in his home is thoughtlessly smashed by his rambunctious toddler, the hunter's own leg breaks. And so there's mystical connection between the hunter and the moose physically. And for reasons that are not entirely clear in the story, the hunter doesn't want any treatment for his leg. Instead, he sends his wife and child away to a community and insists his sister behead him with an axe. And after much resistance, she agrees to do so, at which point he transforms into a moose and she prepares his body for consumption as you would prepare a moose. At her brother's spiritual direction, the sister makes a medicine bag from the moose's head. And through this bag, the brother's spirit stays with the sister as a guide, helping her to escape on a journey to a Mi'kmaq village. Once there, however, she resides with two older women in their lodge. And when the sister leaves her medicine bag behind one day, one of the older women attempts to snoop inside it. The medicine bag then transforms back into the hunter and kills the would-be thief, but then kills all the occupants of the lodge and eventually his sister as well. His complaint to the sister is, why didn't you take care of me? If you'd taken care of me like you said, we would have been together and I would have shared everything with you. But now, and then it says he strikes his sister down and I presume has killed her. So although puzzling in many respects, the story implies that death awaits those who do not adhere to the protocols for how animal remains should be treated, or who do not keep their agreements with animal spirits. So this is a serious thing. Not keeping an agreement with an animal spirit could result in death, according to this story. And so although Invisible Boy features literal siblings, in prayer, in ceremony, in hunting, and other contexts, the Mi'kmaq often use the phrase Masit Nogama, all my relations, to recognize other animals as our relatives. And so it's part of this network of all animal relations together in an egalitarian web that makes sense of these stories. So while Masit Nogama asserts connection between all beings, some humans and some animals, and develops personal relations that might be expressed using sibling terminology, we also see this in stories. And we also see this reflected in Mi'kmaq community. So for example, Robin Kavanagh and Alfred Metallic did some research in Linguistic Shift First Nation. And there they report people refer to the salmon as their brother. a kinship expressed primarily through subsistence fishing and its associated protocols. The salmon determines which family will have the honor and prestige of sharing the salmon with others in the community. The families pay respect to the salmon by celebrating through a feast and recognizing the contribution of the salmon to the family's physical and spiritual sustenance. So this is a biospiritual economy in which animals sacrifice themselves to feed people who express their gratitude through ceremonies, protocols, and activities that honor the animals. One of the ways Mi'kmaq people demonstrate gratitude in this instance is through ceremonial offerings. So traditionally sweet grass, sage, cedar, or tobacco, but some participants in research studies have offered other objects as well, like jewelry. Migma stories tell us that demonstrating respect is important for maintaining good relations with other animals. So there's a story called Diem's Promise, the promise of the moose, that tells of a Mi'kmaq family close to starvation during a harsh winter. They pray to the creator for food, and a moose appears at their wigwam with a bargain. He told them if they killed a moose only when they were in need, if they made tobacco offerings and treated his body as sacred, then he would always return to feed the people. However, if they disrespected the moose, then he would leave and never return. Like the story of the hunter and the invisible boy, we might assume that the cost of such disrespect is death, in this case due to starvation. To show respect for the moose, the Mi'kmaq use as much of the animal's body as possible. Parts that can't be used have to be returned to the creator via burial. Mi'kmaq hunters also show respect by laying a circle of tobacco around the body, saying a prayer of gratitude. Sometimes a hunter might initiate a pipe ceremony to help release the animal's spirit, to ask forgiveness, and to let the spirit animal know that the gift of its life is appreciated. And then moose meat is shared with those in need, and some Mi'kmaq communities will have a communal freezer for this purpose. This work by Mi'kmaq artist Jerry Evans captures the significance of the Mi'kmaq relation to the moose. So you've got the 8-pointed star in the middle there, symbolizing interconnectedness, but also representing the sun. So the idea of revolution, of turning, of days passing. And then here the moose are shown in an unending cycle, perhaps of death and rebirth. So these concepts that we see showing up in the traditional stories also appear in much of the traditional art. There's also a special category sometimes described as creation stories. And creation stories describe the origins of the universe for a people. They might talk about the great web of life and our place within it. One of these ones that I quite enjoy, it was told by Dean of Unama'ki College, Elder Dr. Stephen Augustine. And it's about how the Mi'kmaq people came to exist. So in that story, the first human being is Glooskap, and he's formed from the red clay of the soil. And so having ancestry through Lennox Island First Nation, I immediately think of PEI. Prince Edward Island has this vibrant red soil. And so part of me suspects that perhaps Glooskap is generally from that area because the story features the soil as red. Initially in the story, Glooskap lacks mobility. He's trapped on his back in the dirt until the creator frees him. Roger Lewis, who's a Mi'kmaq historian and an archaeologist, notes that Mi'kmaq speakers express their place of origin using the verb Eskikewa'kik, and it means we sprouted from. This term expresses the idea of being rooted in the land, much like a plant. So when you're saying where you're from, you would use this I sprouted from verb. And so I think maybe this helps people who are perhaps Mi'kmaq speakers grasp the concepts of the stories in a deeper, more meaningful way than those of us who are trying to reclaim Mi'kmaq are able to do most of the time. In Dr. Augustine's story, the creator makes an old woman from a dewy rock to be Glooskap's grandmother, Nagumi. Nagumi provides Glooskap with wisdom. In exchange, Glooskap is agreeing to provide Nagumi with food. These images are from an animated version of the story that is narrated by Ida Denny and directed by Tasha Rain Ramsey. So one portion of the story is called Nagumi and Fire, a portion of this Mi'kmaq creation story, where the grandmother is met in the story. So Glooskap is friends with all the animals. Particularly, he's got this friend, Abistanoich, the American pine marten. When Nagumi explains she can't live on plants and berries alone, Glooskap asks his friend Abistanoich to sacrifice himself, and the pine marten agrees. And he permits Glooskap's grandmother to snap his neck. However, once Abistanoich is dead, Glooskap regrets it, and his grandmother prays to the creator, and Abistanoich comes back to life. But his previous body also remains there, able to be consumed. And I found this a really interesting story, particularly for the technique it indicates of how reincarnation will function. So one of the things that stood out to me in terms of food related to Abistanoich is that the motivation for Glooskap's request is survival. He's not looking to kill his friend because he wants the pleasure of eating him. And then the second thing that stood out was this regretted animal death that Glooskap has. So I saw that as rooted in our view of animals as relatives with a right to life. And at the same time, I was struck by how animals are presented as agreeing to sacrifice themselves to feed human beings. So before being eaten, we see this dynamic of animals as friends in the story. After the animals are described as food, they are then described as siblings, which is a closer relation. And so I saw this theme continuing in the story. One of the next scenes is Glooskap's nephew being born from sea foam caught in sweetgrass. And so Glooskap asks a fish, some say a salmon in some versions of the story, to give up his life so that he can feed the nephew. And so the theme that I saw coming through was of dependence rather than domination. So animals have these independent lives, their own purposes in the story. They're not created in the story as food, but they become food for their friends. And in doing so, become siblings to human beings. At the end of the scene where Abistanoich is dead as a body to be eaten by Nagumi, but also alive as Glooskap's friend and brother, I thought this might signal that the creation story is also describing the origins of animal reincarnation. This idea that the creator sends animals back again in a new body. Migma legal scholar Duma Young has also done research involving traditional Migma stories. Young is the first Indigenous president of Nova Scotia's Barristers Society, and he shares a tale called Man Singing for Animals, which focuses heavily on the idea of reincarnation among animals. So the story features these two young men on a journey, and they come across a man and his grandmother living together in a wigwam. The couple welcome them in, they feed them, and they invite them to stay the night. In this regard, I felt the man was very reminiscent of Glooskap, who's frequently described as living with his grandmother. The man in this story says, I have my grandmother living with me. She has been with me since the world was made. And so already we know there's something kind of supernatural about these people. Although because the Mi'kmaq are also funny, I think it's entirely possible that they see this as a joke about how old the folks are. As the sun goes down, the man begins to keep time on a birch bark drum, and he begins to sing. I am man singing for animals. I am singing for the animals, for all the animals, to come alive, to come back to life from all parts of them. All those wings, heads, feet, all those bones, meat, marrow, all those parts of them that have not been eaten by the people, all those parts of them that have not been eaten by animals, all those parts of them that have been thrown away. Man sings all night, which, reading the story for the first time, I thought, what a terrible way to treat your guests. He sings all night long with these new guests in his home. And then he shares a teaching with them about not wasting animal parts. In the morning, the man leads the youth to the shoreline and he plays a whistle made from a shell. In response to the music, fish arrive, visible through the clear water. These are my fish, say the man. They have come from all parts of fish which people throw away on the shore. I sing for them and they come back. Every night, the man repeats a song and live animals emerge from the animal bones over which he sings, with moose, caribou, mink, beaver, and bear specifically mentioned in the story. So I had come across something like this in a previous story. In Mi'kmaq Anthology, Rita Joe shared the teaching that animal bones should be returned to their habitat. So for instance, fish bones put back in the water. So the spirits awaken in their home when they reincarnate. And so looking at particular stories, it was really important to connect up the details of that story with details from other pieces of Mi'kmaq life and culture. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. So the stories related practices, and they express a belief in reincarnation. And then they detail how diligent ceremonies of love and respect support the animal return, and they preserve the species the Mi'kmaq rely on for food. Duma Young describes the tale of man singing for animals as a classic Ulnu teaching story to instill Mi'kmaq protocols about treating animals with respect and honor. The failure of this, of course, is that animals would be unwilling to sacrifice themselves in the future. And so Young suggests man singing for animals illustrates the Mi'kmaq principle that sees the whole animal as capsulated in each of its parts, meaning that if a piece of bone or a material is still present, the animal can be restored. So this is long before people had concepts of DNA, but it also sheds light on earlier tales of the enraged hunter who springs back to life from the medicine bag made of the head of the moose into which he had transformed. And so this idea that a big thing can be entirely encapsulated within one small piece of its own part recurs across story. Naomi Metallic's work also works with stories. She's another Mi'kmaq scholar using traditional stories. Her legal methods course has students read 5 to 6 Mi'kmaq stories and then create a framework of legal principles. They then apply that framework of legal principles to a loosely fictitious case study featuring a local Mi'kmaq community. Metallic says that this helps counter some of the demoralization that comes when Indigenous students realize how their communities are treated under settler law. She says, what I see with our students who take the Indigenous law course is that it's very empowering for them. And for some, they said that it was the highlight of their law school career. And you know that there's a role for them in their communities and a role for them perhaps in doing this work. So the use of stories in Indigenous law and other disciplines helps my own work in social determinants of health be relevant to other disciplines and the work of other Mi'kmaq scholars, even if like Young and Metallic, they're working in law instead of in health. A lot of my own work on these stories has focused on relating the ideas in the stories to particular Mi'kmaq values, and then looking at how those values might inform Mi'kmaq approaches to contemporary issues, especially those that affect urban Indigenous people. So half of Indigenous people in Canada currently live in an urban center. And so looking at how can we engage some of those stories, none of which are usually set in an urban center, how can we engage those values to use them as a lens for examining contemporary issues? That's been one of my passions when it comes to Migma stories. So I've examined the stories that involve food and animals particularly, and then use that work to examine issues not often taken up by Indigenous studies, such as lab-grown meat. What are people's thoughts on lab-grown meat? We haven't surveyed the Mi'kmaq about this, but when I look at our traditional stories, I see a number of things that some of which throw up a red flag or raise important questions. And so most of my work looking at traditional stories have looked at how do we apply those values. Points to consider for doing similar work, though. There are many points to think about when analyzing an Indigenous story. I'll talk about the Mi'kmaq ones because those are the ones I know best. The first is the transmission has been terribly disrupted. So residential schools severed children from their Indigenous cultures, and this prevented the passing on of traditional stories. So it nearly eliminated the languages in which those stories would have been told. And so we don't have a smooth segue of every story told in every generation in many, many contexts across multiple families that we might have had in the past. And so many generations don't know particular traditional stories. And as a result, we see stories that are separated from their cultural context of traditional storytelling. And so many people, many contemporary Mi'kmaq youth might not know any of these stories. The second issue is the stories in the text are tailored for a settler audience often. So one of the biggest sources are 2 volumes by Silas Rand, that Baptist minister I mentioned. He was a fluent speaker of Mi'kmaq reportedly, and he recorded 2 volumes of Mi'kmaq stories called Legends of the Micmacs, volume 1 and 2, in about 1894 or 1895. Nearly 90 years later, in 1983, poet Alden Noland published 9 Micmac legends. Ruth Holmes Whitehead has published 2 collections in 88 and 89. And then Mi'kmaq people themselves have collected traditional stories in print, sometimes with settler co-editors. So Mi'kmaq poet and scholar Rita Joe and worked with Leslie Choice on the Mi'kmaq anthology. And then in 2000, Michael B. Runningwolf and Patricia Clark Smith produced On the Trail of Elder Brother, Glooskap stories of the Mi'kmaq Indians. And then we see contemporary works that are inspired by traditional stories or that tell a traditional story in a new way. So here's an example called Wolverine and Little Thunder, an eel fishing story. And it's by Mi'kmaq artist and musician Alan Syliboy, who also does all of the drawings for it. And then we see stories showing up in videos and multimedia works, such as Nagumi and Fire by Nigweg Collective. And that's just last year, 2022. It's a portion of the Mi'kmaq creation story told in Mi'kmaq with English subtitles. So One of the warnings I'll put out there is this editorial process that most of these works go through when they're intended for a settler audience means that many of them are no longer encapsulating or reflecting Mi'kmaq ways of thinking and speaking. It's been edited out. And so what we have are maybe ideas that have been slightly altered. And so we can't rely that the story as told encapsulates everything that the Mi'kmaq person who shared that story might have wanted. So we have to be sure to confirm the ideas that we get from the stories with other sources of cultural information. We need to triangulate our ideas. The next issue is the text loses the gestures that aid recollection and comprehension when it's a text. So you can't engage those issues. The things that might be the details of a single telling get concretized as the only telling. And so the story loses the flexibility that made storytelling a valuable teaching tool. And then a legal issue, some stories collected by scholars undermine Mi'kmaq cultural ownership, as Canadian copyright law views collections as the property of the collector rather than the storytellers or their communities. So that's a significant issue that made many Mi'kmaq people hesitant to share their stories at all. I guess I'll sign off and thank you now, but before I do, I'll just note that with the linguistic shift, we're seeing stories going back into Mi'kmaq via Mi'kmaq language texts and multimedia works. And that's an exciting direction that I'm happy to see happening in terms of future Mi'kmaq story analysis. And we also see the social element. So I think it's great to have stories that you can access anytime, but I'd also love to see storytelling restore that interactive context in which stories were originally shared, to transmit not just the content, but the embodied relationship that stories let us communicate to each other. And so I'll say Walaliok, which is thank all of you for your time and attention, and I'll look forward to our discussion. Over to you, Manisha.
Thank you so much, Dr. Robinson, for that wonderful presentation. We do have time now for questions, and I see that there are some comments in the chat. So Krista is asking, where can we read more about your work in connection with cellular meat? And Jay has asked, do the Mi'kmaq believe in human reincarnation? If so, is it always human to human, or can humans take rebirth as animals? How do the Mi'kmaq determine who the reborn person is or will be? Do today's Mi'kmaq maintain these beliefs?
Oh, good question.
Your thoughts on
those. Yeah, so if you're looking to see my work on applying Mi'kmaq values from stories to issues like artificial produced moose meat, I wrote a story, an article called "Is the Moose Still My Brother If We Don't Eat Him?" And so many of those issues from those stories are taken up in that piece. In terms of does the reincarnation also apply to humans? Yes, it does. And so I've seen a number of my Mi'kmaq contemporaries specifically indicate this, usually on Facebook discussions. Although I haven't had it come up in interpersonal interactions as often. But many of the Mi'kmaq are quite technologically advanced, and so a lot of that discussion happens online. In terms of how do you tell who's being reborn as whom and who's whom, it varies wildly. I remember as a child, my dad was out in the yard and this bird was following him around, and I commented on it or something, and he told me that his cat Archie, his cat Buffy had come back to him as a bird, had been reincarnated and was now following him around the property as a bird. And so something about his engagement with that bird made him feel that this was that same being he had known as a cat. And so I think there are elements of that decision about how do we know that are in some ways about the nature of the relationship you have with the being, regardless of any changes you might perceive in their physicality. So there's something about, there's like a spiritual element that is helping that, that decision-making, that identity. Were the stories told in special form? Verse to help with memorization. I wish I knew more Mi'kmaq so that I would be able to tell, like, if there's an element of versification or of rhyming. But I do know that so my family grew up telling stories in English. And so none of these traditional stories featured, but they would have family stories that they would tell. And so there weren't verses for memorization, but there would be sometimes actions, and those helped quite a bit with memorization. And there would be, I think, maybe pet phrases that people really liked the sound of that they would use again and again, and that would vary by storyteller. Although sometimes if you heard a good storyteller, you might pick up the versions that they do as well. Do you think adopting epistemologies of Indigenous communities by modern education systems can combat modern problems of the Anthropocene? Yes. So one of the things that I think is important about Mi'kmaq story analysis is to be able to tease apart the axiological from the ontological, from the epistemological. So if something is a claim about knowledge, and I think many stories could develop a knowledge and epistemological framework the same way that Naomi Metallic's students were developing legal frameworks for Indigenous law. I think we could do the same kind of work with Mi'kmaq stories and then apply that to educational contexts. The benefit here is stories were used to teach. So I think the segue there is quite nice.
Margaret, there was also a question by Saren. Are there any Mi'kmaq stories in which humans sacrifice themselves as food for animals, or is it always the other way around?
Oh, interesting. Well, I mean, humans are animals, and this comes through quite often in the Mi'kmaq stories, where people will sometimes segue back into animals or human beings. So, for instance, the story of Abistanoich, sometimes he's presented as a little boy, and sometimes he's presented as a pine marten. And so in some stories, Glooskap and Abistanoich are humans. And then in other stories, it's Glooskap hanging out with this pine marten. And so they don't really explain it to you. They don't it's kind of like getting dropped in the middle of a series without any of the other episodes. Like you don't know the backstory to anything. And the story of the man who transforms into a moose. In that story, that transformation is made possible because the moose is his spirit animal. And so he uses his moose body to feed humans, but I haven't yet encountered a story where humans use a human body to feed animals. Although there are lots of Mi'kmaq traditions that involve feeding animals. I remember my grandmother putting out a plate for the old man, she called it, but it's really about, I think, putting out a plate to feed animals in the neighborhood.
If I could just follow up on that, I once had a colleague suggest, an Indigenous colleague who came to speak to my law class on animals, culture and law, suggest that the reason that the stories perhaps go one way is that it's a way of making sense of an unfortunate reality or an unfortunate kind of task to be done, and making it more kind of palatable to the humans who undertake the task. Would you have a similar view, or what would be your response to that?
Well, I think there is definitely a tension in the Mi'kmaq stories that I read between having a close relation with animals that is emotional, highly emotional in nature, as well as spiritual and physical, and the attachment that you get to beings that you live with intimately on a daily basis, and the need to eat. And so I see this theme of regretted animal death showing up in stories. And at the same time, I see that juxtaposed against the idea that animals are really so clever that if they didn't let us catch them, we never would, because we all kind of are terrible at most of the things we try. Like if there was a great chain of being for the Mi'kmaq, human beings would be at the bottom. We're like the least efficient animal. And so human beings in Mi'kmaq stories are usually presented as needing help from the others to even get by. And so I think it could be a mechanism of psychological comfort to believe that the animals that I love are permitting me to eat them. I was a child living next door to a farmer who had a pig. One day we went and the pig wasn't there. And I discovered where bacon came from that day. And so I think there are, in every relation between humans and animals, if those humans are going to be eating those animals, there are elements of discomfort there. And so I could see that that kind of a story or that belief could reflect that psychological need. However, I also think that the Mi'kmaq have a lot of psychological and spiritual resources to draw on. So I don't know that that would just because it seems like it would be comforting doesn't necessarily mean that's its intent. So I think there are elements here of a maybe particularly Mi'kmaq view of the world in which animals are just the smartest things on the planet and we're trying to keep up. Yeah, I think there's definitely more that we need to tease out, particularly because like a lot of my work is me alone with the story. And I think these are really intended to be read and understand best in a group. And so I think the way that Metallic has been approaching it with youth as a group, I think that's a great start in terms of a methodology. I just happened to use the methodology I'd learned in theological college.
Thank you, Margaret. So please do keep the questions coming. If I may, Dr. Robinson, I'll just ask kind of two big questions just from the insights you shared right now. So one is like, thinking about, the image of the great chain of being so kind of standard in what we learn growing up, let's say in dominant Western culture here in Canada. And relating it to the last section of the paper about, and what you said about your enthusiasm in your previous work and ongoing to take these stories and relate them to contemporary issues. What do you see as kind of the kind of pathway or scope for Canadian institutions, for example, Dalhousie University, University of Victoria, other types of institutions? What is their, what should they be doing that perhaps they're not with respect to these stories? Because we hear a lot about indigenization at the university and also in other institutions, and a lot of great intentions, but and some important work being done. But for myself, I'm not yet seeing a connection with rethinking how the university, for example, or other institutions interacts with animals, whether it's with respect to food, use of animals, or research use of animals, or even like development on campus and how that kind of displaces animals and in the land. So, the themes of care versus domination and even reincarnation, seeing, grieving for animals, regretting animal death, seeing animals as kind of spiritual beings. So much of that arguably is so foreign to dominant ways of seeing animals. Do you see any kind of, are you optimistic about Canadian institutions being able to now, to really take these stories forward? Or do you think actually that's maybe something they shouldn't be doing? It should be more of that's actually not the place for institutions to work with the stories. But so I told you it was a big question. So let me leave it there and see.
So I'll start by saying one of the first things institutions can do is look at their archives, because the Canadian law that says the person who collects the thing owns the thing rather than the person from whom you collected it. When it comes to stories, you may have a whole bunch of Indigenous stories sitting in a cellar somewhere or a warehouse that could be returned to the Indigenous community from which they were taken. So, they might be on very old technology. People have found Indigenous stories, for instance, on wax cylinders. If you read some of the work done with the Indigenous community groups in among the Wolastoq, I know a lot of their stories. There was a long-standing legal battle between the scholar who had collected the stories and the community from which the stories had come. His family saying, well, those belong to the estate. And the university weighed in on that issue, actually on the side of the Indigenous community, saying, your relative collected these things, but they weren't really theirs, even though they are under Canadian law. And so being able to repatriate that material would be a good start for a lot of that reconciliation relationship building, because Indigenous communities have long memories. And so when a university scholar comes to them and says, hey, we'd like to start building a relationship, and the community says, great, how about returning that stuff you stole from us 300 years ago? There's a long, there may be already a relationship that you're not aware of, and it might be negative. And so these things, they're not being used. And so I think universities could easily do without a lot of those, and returning them is the right thing to do there. In terms of what they can do with the stories actively, I think you could engage some of the values from the stories around how you change the way campus buildings are designed. So for instance, a lot of campus construction happens without much thought about what are the animals that live in that environment, even if it's an urban environment. And I think one of the things that the reincarnation idea stresses is the importance of habitat protection. That if the animals have to be put back into their natural habitat so they can reincarnate, that habitat needs to be there. And so you see a lot of Mi'kmaq people involved in struggles around ecology, habitat protection, water protection, and often this is criminalized in Canada, in the US. And so that kind of issue about how do we develop a reconciled relationship in a place where we still criminalize the expression of Indigenous value, that's a really big question. And so universities could be contributing to that discussion in a really active way, and could be using Indigenous practices and Indigenous frameworks to inform their own decision making. It doesn't have to be an obvious Indigenous connection for that to happen. So when Dalhousie decided they wanted to revamp the quad, which is a big lawn that we have on our campus, and they decided let's have some traditional local plants, they did an enormous consultation process, and a lot of what they heard was about making the space more Mi'kmaq. And so that is happening. And so that's kind of, it's exciting to see those changes. Similarly, when they talk about what are we going to eat at an Indigenous research conference, it's no longer automatically assumed that everyone there is going to be eating meat, even though they know everyone there might be Indigenous. And that I can see is a huge difference than it was even at academic spaces 5-10 years ago. So it's, I'm already seeing change.
Thank you. Well, Tatiana asks a related question. First, she says, thank you for your talk and providing these deep thoughts on the importance of the Indigenous stories. Have you come across practical examples of the law and guidance provided in Migma Stories being applied in policymaking?
Only so far in the practice that Naomi Metallic is doing with the students in terms of developing the legal frameworks and then applying it as a case study. So they're practicing to do it, but it can also really be done. And so Indigenous governance is really about how do we move those Indigenous values that we have as communities into policy and practice? How do we govern with these things? And so I think there's a lot of opportunities to take that same work up into political science, to take it up into a number of fields that could benefit from trying to figure out how do we apply those things in a contemporary way.
Naeem has a question. Do you think a belief in reincarnation might be counterproductive in the sense that it may be received as superstitious, as there's no real way for us to establish that as a fact?
Yeah, so you see this all the time where, one group will say, well, our spiritual beliefs are perfectly reasonable, and the other group's spiritual beliefs are mere superstition. And so we see that dynamic a lot in colonialism, where Indigenous beliefs are framed as somehow less logical, less reasonable. And so I think it's it's definitely often running in the background, almost like a program people don't want to acknowledge when people are having different discussions. You can see that assumptions about what spirituality and even sometimes religion should have a place or not in particular spaces. I'm a secular atheist, so I often find that I'm encountering spiritual ideas in places I expect to find social and cultural ideas. And so being able to say, okay, these things aren't separate genres so much as they're interlinked or even unified ideas in some of the people that I hear them from. And so they may not be distinguishing, if you're doing a research project, for instance, with Mi'kmaq people, they might not distinguish between what's a religious or spiritual value and what's a cultural value or a social value. And so being able to say, okay, maybe these categories, how I'm labeling it isn't as important as what are they doing with it and what does it mean to them? And so trying not to get caught up on the labeling thing for me has been an important learning tool. In general, I find the Mi'kmaq are more interested in what is the relation between things, whereas my scholarly settler training has said, what is the categorization of things is the most important question. And so I see these coming together sometimes really helpful in creative ways. But those different frameworks, ways of seeing the world can also butt up against each other and make it difficult. So yeah, if people are going to say, oh, well, you know, these are just some sort of superstitious ideas to make you feel better about having been hunting, I could see why someone might interpret it that way.
Thank you, Dr. Robinson. Holly asks, well, first she says, thank you for sharing your paper and your presentation. I appreciated your connection between ecofeminist principles and the 2007 Kinnear study with Migma story examples of understanding animals as siblings or cousins and the phrase all my relations. With your background in food studies and vegan ethics, have you encountered traditional stories of ancestors who chose to not eat animals, their relations on principle, and how they might have navigated the social implications of that?
There are a few. So in the creation story, when Nagumi gets introduced, the grandmother character, she has to explain to Glooskap that she needs more than plants and berries to survive. And I thought, why does Glooskap need to be told this? Like, I know he just got born, but what's Glooskap been eating? And so it raised a question for me at that point. Was Glooskap eating anything before his grandmother came along? And if so, was it plants and berries, as that line implied to me? Now, I might be reading too much into the text. And so the fact that it's frozen in text might be making it difficult for me to see beyond that interesting to me question. So I'd love to hear like different versions of the story to see if anyone tries to fill that gap about what was Glooskap eating before grandmother came along. There's also a story featuring a magical pot, and you put the animal bones into it to cook, and an unlimited supply of meat comes out of the magical pot. And so the woman who owns this magical pot, refuse, you might say, bones someone has already cleaned all the meat from, that goes into the pot, but it comes out with meat. And so I think that kind of a story is also indicative of that wish I didn't have to kill animals to eat idea. And so I think, I don't know personally any Mi'kmaq vegans, but I've met other indigenous vegans. And so I think with stories like that, there's definitely a thread there that I can see. Here are earlier expressions of, gosh, wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to eat the animals we like?
Thanks, Dr. Robinson. I'll just add that Name follows up with respect to the spirituality question, just commenting instead, maybe we could only focus on real aspects of our interconnectedness with and situatedness in the world. And Victoria's comment is, thank you very much for this excellent session. I have been quoting your work for years in our UBC Animal Law Seminar. Your work is invaluable. So I'll just take the chair's prerogative again and ask a question that I'm really interested in. Given the kind of what I understand, not being an English a faculty member or even a major back in undergrad, is it the case, Dr. Robinson, that most of the stories that you work with and share, would you describe them as short stories? And if they are short stories versus like what is maybe traditionally seen as a novel or the long story, do you think that the length of the story or the format of the story is important to understanding the story, or has some other relevance in how we should interpret what are the ideas being conveyed?
Yeah, I think they must. So some of the stories are very short, almost more an idea with some characters sketched out. And so for those, I wonder if maybe the storytelling was more about some of the physical expression. But that part of the story has been lost because it's been textualized. Some of the stories are very long and segue through multiple characters and almost feel as a new reader, they feel like here's a bunch of stories sort of patchwork together. And so I'm not immediately seeing what the storyteller must see as the connection between those tales. So for instance, The Invisible Boy, the story that features the hunter who turns into the moose, earlier in that story, there's this, as the title suggests, an invisible boy. And it's really about whether people are able to see the boy or not, and all the social repercussions of whether or not people can see this invisible person. And it doesn't really, to my mind, connect up really clearly with this other piece of the same story about the hunter. I don't understand what the connection is. And so I think there might be pieces that we're losing in the telling or in the collection process. So it might be that whoever wrote it down just thought they went together, or there might have been something in the way that the Migma was communicated to the person who was speaking Migma as a new speaker that they missed out on. And so there's a number of things that are just mysterious to me that I don't quite understand how, if I'm seeing remnants of these were once separate stories told in different contexts, but in this instance, the individual telling the story just happened to link them all together. Or if the storyteller saw some clear connection that has been since lost to me and apparently lost to the editor. And so I would say they're short stories, but being able to categorize them in that kind of way isn't very helpful, because I suspect they would have been told either while doing an activity together. So, you're maybe fishing for eel and you tell a story about eel fishing. Or they would have been told particular times of year when people would be gathering in groups, when the nights were really long. And so sometimes people have made multimedia versions of some of the stories and posted them on YouTube, for instance, and then received comments in the comments section on YouTube saying, this story is only supposed to be told at the winter time. And so creating a video that someone could access at any time of the year undermines the intent of the story. I thought it was a really interesting point. And so I find I'm often faced with the challenge of, is it more important to know the story and to preserve what I see as something important about our culture? Or is it more important to preserve some aspect of how the story was shared? Is that the important piece? And so it can be difficult to make those decisions and try to know, like, what's the right thing to do? Which piece of the culture is important? And I'm afraid the academic training I got from English tends me to lean toward the text of the story. But I'd love to work with other people who maybe could know more about why is the time of year and the communication of the story at the time of year more significant. If there may be pieces of that I just don't know because I didn't grow up in a Mi'kmaq community. I grew up in a fairly assimilated settler space with Mi'kmaq people.
And so I think that brings us to kind of the question that are reflected in the next two questions, perhaps the idea of different interpretations and kind of a change in what the stories mean over time, or even at the same time, but given different receivers of the story. So Kishore asks, do multiple storytellers embellish stories of animals and make them interesting to the audience? And Ranjana asks, have stories changed over time, or are they meant to stay the same? Any comments there, Margaret, about perhaps different interpretations and change?
Yeah, so I've been fortunate enough to see a couple of different versions of stories communicated by different people, usually preserved in text, but a couple of times I've seen audio-visual where people were telling the story, for instance. And storytellers do definitely tell the story different each time. And some stories feature elements that aren't in some of the other versions. And so when I'm trying to analyze what elements of the story seem really important for a particular topic, like, in vitro meat, if the story doesn't have that section in it in one version and it has it in the other, that's an important difference to me. And so my training in textual hermeneutics is very interested in different versions that are different from one another, because I went to theological school for my master's and PhD, and so different versions of religious texts were highly significant. It often indicated different communities and had different meaning attached to them. And what I think I'm seeing in the Mi'kmaq versions are maybe regional versions, regional variations, maybe the embellishment of individual storytellers. Some storytellers are very engaging, and so they have a style that people kind of look for in their story. And so if the story doesn't come with that style to it, the person adds that style maybe. And so I think each storyteller tells it a little differently, and every storyteller might tell it differently each time. Because if you're telling a story to little kids, they have a short attention span. You need to get right in there. And if you're telling a story to an adult, maybe they're a little more worldly wise. You can connect up some of the ideas in a more sophisticated way. And so I think there's many things we can learn about how the Mi'kmaq teach and how they communicated ideas that enabled them to share what is actual factual information. So for instance, the information about the giant beaver, that information passed on for possibly 13,000 years accurately through storytelling. And so I think when people share stories, there's something important about the story, but there's also something about that engagement between the teller and the listener. It's not just about what's getting transmitted. It's about the who, the what, the where, it's all the package. And so I think that if we tease out just the text part and say that's the story, we're missing a lot of the other pieces.
And Dr. Robinson, I'll just close with one question I cannot resist. Do you think that gender is a critical filter by which people understand the story, so the gender of the listener, and has that been important in your own analysis of the stories, for example, the invisible boy, or just that it's the brothers, right, doing the hunting, or the grandmother is there with the other parties and not a grandfather? How would you describe how gender has been important to your work in thinking through these stories?
Yeah, and in this, maybe I'll connect up with Anita's question here about how the Mi'kmaq storytelling might differ from other nations. So the Mi'kmaq are, we've been described in various ways. Most of the Mi'kmaq women that I know say we're a matriarchal society, that women are in charge. And I know in my own family, that's how it was. So my grandmother was in charge of the family. And when she died, I remember sending my cousin a Facebook message saying, who's in charge of the family now? And it was my aunt, who was the next oldest woman. And so I thought, well, maybe this is just how things are. But then going to friends' houses as a little kid, I realized, why is your dad telling your mom what to do all the time? And realizing, oh, there's this other dynamic that is highly gendered that I haven't been growing up with in my space. And so I think looking at the stories, you definitely see the importance of grandmothers come through. So a lot of characters, older male characters are presented as living with a grandmother. So we've got the Bluescap, man who sings for animals. And I think the importance of the grandmother echoes in the stories the way the Mi'kmaq do Catholicism. So Jesus's grandmother, not a very important character in the big scheme of Catholicism, but to the Mi'kmaq, she's the main character. Jesus is interesting, but a lot of the big events are about his grandmother. And so you do see this shift in Mi'kmaq culture that focuses in on what are older women up to. And so I see that in a lot of the stories where older women are presented as, we sometimes look at Hollywood films and say, well, oh, she's just being the girl in this scene, or like they're not giving her anything to do. But that's not the case for women in Mi'kmaq stories. They shape the plot, and not just in terms of shaping the dilemma of the male hero. There are stories that have female protagonists. Now, I do notice there's a tendency to have some of the female protagonists be a little focused, maybe even hyper-focused on relationships, like romantic relationships especially. And there's a lot of joking that occurs in the stories related to potential romantic entanglements. But I also like that there's a little more of the heroic female in our stories than I would encounter, I think, in a lot of like the mainstream Disney stuff I grew up with. And so I think other Indigenous cultures, their stories kind of do the same thing. It says, here's the way we look at gender. Because Indigenous feminism has generally not seen our own culture as the problem. We've generally tended to see sexism as a thing that comes with colonialism, rather than something that is indicative to our elements of our own culture. That said, although the big P problem isn't Indigenous men for Indigenous women, that certainly doesn't mean that there aren't gender dynamics in the community that can come through in some of these stories. So, when I read a story where the man who used to be a moose, who sacrificed his own life to feed his sister, then kills her because some stranger she was staying with looked in her medicine bag, I feel like that's a problem. Like I find it difficult not to read that through a gender violence lens. And so I think that's maybe where being engaged with other people in the community who are also interested in doing story analysis and saying what they see getting out of things, it might help me to say, okay, maybe there are other lenses I could be looking at some of these elements with. And I'm sure there would be even more rich gender analysis that could be done in a room full of Mi'kmaq elders who are well versed in different versions of the same story. I think that could be a lot of fun.
Thank you so much, Dr. Robinson, for that last explanation, and just for the wonderfully compelling presentation, such an engaging Q&A as well. At this time, we'd also like to thank the Brooks Institute for Animal Rights Law and Policy for funding this lecture series. Thank you also to our co-presenters at the University of Victoria, Circle, Iluru, the Center for Global Studies, the Department of Gender Studies, and the Center for Studies in Religion and Society. Next up in our Distinguished Lecture Series on February 14th, Valentine's Day, is Dr. James Telly, Professor Emeritus of Political Science and Law, Philosophy from the University of Victoria and Indigenous Governance, presenting under the title, Animals as Citizens of Gaia Democracy. And you can pre-register for the online event on our website following the link provided at the top of the chat. I want to end again by thanking Dr. Robinson. Please join me in thanking her, and thank you to all of you who joined us today from your respective locations. Thanks, everyone. Wishing everyone the best till our next February session.
Thank you so much for having me, Manisha. This has been really fun.